So thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Sandy, for asking me to comment on these 3 papers, which I really enjoyed reading. And I'll try to be relatively quick. I'm not sure we're going to have a whole lot of time for discussion, but we'll see what happens. I was interested in thinking about these 3 papers in terms of what they could tell us about occupation more generally. So I'm going to begin with that thought, or at least something on that theme. So at their most basic, military occupations are about invasion, control, and the subsequent exploitation of territory and resources. They result in the overlay of one group of people on one or more other groups, creating zones of contact and interaction. This panel asked how 3 non-traditional archival approaches, combining fieldwork with an anthropological reading of trial dossiers, taking a visual history approach or a film-focused approach, might offer innovative ways not only to examine the individual layers that made up German-occupied France from 1940 to 44, but also to identify and understand the many places where those layers met and overlapped. As Abigail Lewis shows us, for example, André Zuccat might represent a layer of French photographers producing images of French life that were distinguished by a fascination with affect, what she calls embodiment, and cultural life. After 1940, Zuccat's layer encountered a layer of German occupation authorities who, in exchange for granting Zuccat permission to photograph, wanted to direct the kinds of photos he took and use them for their own propaganda purposes. Zuccat's photography shifted to take into account these new conditions, as did the work of other cultural professionals in similar positions, as Brett Bowles' comments about Marcel Pagnol underline. If we stick with the notion that occupations are composed of layers, it would be tempting to read Sandra Ott's Basque villagers as a relatively autonomous layer, high in the Pyrenees, little affected by the war years. That may have been how the villagers themselves first presented things, encouraging Sandra in the 1970s to think that she didn't really need to know or should not ask about the occupation years. But when she later visited the archives to investigate those years, she found that an anthropological approach, the techniques that had served her fieldwork so well, might equally well be applied to reading archival sources, which could then be presented in the form of a series of trial narratives. Examined from an anthropological point of view, focusing on values, rituals, networks, interactions between various actors, the sources revealed much more about the interplay of occupiers and occupied populations than the surface texts implied. In the paper that she presented today, Sandra wondered how and to what extent her anthropological approach differs from more conventional historical approaches to the archives. And certainly, given the now widespread practice of cultural history, the differences are fewer today, perhaps, than they might have been several decades ago. But it's a question that I can't answer on my own, and hopefully we'll have a little time to take it up after I finish talking. It's clear that few historians can ever hope to have the kind of long-term familiarity with their subjects that Sandra enjoys. And indeed, I would like to know a little bit more about how having such a vast array of field knowledge influences not only the approach to the archives, but also the actual reading of the trial records. So does knowing particular individuals as they are today make it difficult to read the records in an impartial way? And how do you avoid anachronism? Because it might be tempting to assume that Basques in the 40s behaved much the same way as they did in the 70s or as they do today. Is that a problem? Or is it something that other anthropological tools, maybe like being open about one's own position as a researcher, these sorts of things, could help address? Above all, Sandra's work underlines the value for any researcher of getting to know both the physical and human terrain of one's research and of thinking about how traditionally anthropological topics or themes such as gift giving function over the longer term. Keeping the longer term in mind, Abigail Lewis's paper demonstrated how looking at the photographer Zuccat's work from the 1930s through the 1960s reinforced the ideas that, notably in visual terms, occupations are embedded in their surrounding eras. If we take up the layering analogy again, Zuccat's photographic layer existed before, during, and after the occupation, shifting between 1940 and 1944 to take new circumstances into account. Which way and how far the layer shifted remains unclear because, as Lewis indicates, whether the photographs Zuccat took are seen as collaborationist, neutral, or even opposed to the regime depends on the context in which they're read. Published in Signal, they appeared to support the regime. In a post-war courtroom context, a witness for the defense argued that instead, they were visual hymns to the notion of an eternal France, to our Paris, over which a layer of German occupiers had been imposed. Even Even within the occupation context, though, such photographs might have been understood in divergent ways by different viewers. And the story reminded me of the work of Roger Chasles, and I think we've talked a little bit about Roger Chasles, another occupation-era French photographer who published a collection of pre-war pictures in 1942 as Reflets de France. The book collected pastoral images of a country entirely without occupiers, which wouldn't be surprising except that the very same photographs were soon published in a German edition that was bought by occupying soldiers. I have a dedicated copy of this. Somebody clearly sent it home to their family at Christmas. Chasles' celebration of timeless French scenery and historical monuments might have been designed in part to get around the censors, but it also suggested, even to German readers, an alternate vision of France that would survive long after the occupation years. Even as it appeared to send a German-approved message, such a book subtly undermined German claims to control photographic representation of the country, offering a patriotic French rather than a strictly German view of the land. The catch, though, was that any interpretation of the images remained in the eye of the beholder. So the same photographs that spoke of an eternal, timeless France to a French photographer and a French audience also served occupying soldiers as visual hooks upon which to hang their own slippery and very different memories. Turning back to Zuccas's photographs, the third reading of these works, as Abby told us, occurred in 2008 when their display at the Bibliothèque Historique de la Ville de Paris caused a scandal, mainly because present-day audiences couldn't imagine that life under occupation had actually included pleasant or pleasant-seeming moments. People wanted to believe that because he depicted war-era life in Paris in a sunlit, lighthearted way, Zuccas must have been a collaborator, and therefore the exhibit shouldn't have been allowed. Even at the time, the scandal was reminiscent of the reaction when American newspapers first published images from the photo album of SS officer Karl Höcker, adjutant to the commander of Auschwitz. The album showed Höcker and other members of the camp's brutal administration, including women, relaxing, singing, and enjoying blueberries at a rest facility about 30 kilometers south of the concentration camp gates. And if you want to see the pictures, they're on the Holocaust Memorial Museum's website. To many people, the photos were deeply jarring, testifying to our own inability, or unwillingness probably, to fathom the coexistence of leisure and violence, seemingly ordinary life and deep oppression. By confronting audiences with a broader range of photographs than the ones typically selected to illustrate war and occupation, both the Zuccas exhibit and the Höcker album made this coexistence difficult to ignore. In addition to adding equipment to researchers' toolboxes then, unconventional sources and approaches introduce new themes, and they can serve as a prompt to look for these themes in other types of sources as well. As I read your paper, Abigail, with its plenitude of insights about photography, you seem to be, although you had clearly thought about these images in a visual way, you seem to be somewhat frustrated by the lack of textual documents to go with them. And I'm not sure it should be a big concern. I don't know if the frustration is one you should be too worried about, is what I'm trying to say. Does one need to have images to read texts? Well, most historians would say, no, you don't. And so if that's the case, then why do we feel that we need texts in order to understand or contextualize images properly? Sometimes I think a text can actually obscure meaning in photographs as much as it uncovers it. Images themselves are revelatory, and they can and should be analyzed as visual constructions in and of their own right. That, of course, brings me to Brett Bohl's work on film. It's not possible to delve into every aspect of any of these presentations here, but among other things, both Brett's work and that of Abigail raise the perennial question of artists' complicity with oppressive regimes, and I wouldn't mind hearing more sort of about the contextualization of these papers within sort of larger historiography about the role of, you know, I thought of Leni Riefenstahl. We could mention lots of other people too. But as Brett points out, the question has no clear answer, and in these sorts of sources illustrate well the moral ambiguities of living under occupation. They highlight a feature of occupations, too, that until recently received scant attention. And this is, as Brett phrases it, the ongoing, quote, competition between Germans and French in pursuit of divergent political interests. Far from fitting into a simple black and white schema of collaboration or resistance, occupation was shaped by different groups or individuals defending and pursuing their particular interests. What mattered were not only the actions of specific groups or layers in occupied France, but the interaction between, for example, occupied occupiers, French administrators, the Vichy state, and private companies, as well as individuals. There's exciting research already being undertaken in this area, and I thought of Talbot Imlay and Martin Horn's book on the Ford Motor Company. There might be some comparisons there in terms of sort of looking at how a company works with the occupation authorities in ways that are, on the face of it, collaborative, but in actual fact, there's much, much more going on. So I think commercial enterprises might be particularly good sites for examining this kind of interplay. Brett focuses primarily on areas where the interests of those responsible for film in Germany and France diverged and competed. But I also wonder to what extent there were moments of shared interest and alignment. Was film like other domains, for instance in industry or in social policy, where skills and knowledge were transferred between Germans and French despite war and occupation? Perhaps wartime conditions actually accelerated transfers, not only between Germans and French in France, but in and among occupied areas in Europe as a whole. In this context, I can only second Brett's comments about the need to seek out and use German sources wherever possible. I might also add that a comparative or transnational element could help specify what is unique about the French cases and answer the question of whether and to what extent similar developments were happening in other occupied zones as well. Reading all of these papers with their references to the bad old days when photography in major French archives was forbidden, photography of documents, I mean, or images, and researchers lived in hope of being blessed with the precious dérogation, all of this put me in mind of Antoinette Burton's excellent essay collection, Archive Stories. Among other things, that book includes a wonderful piece by Peter Fritsche about the silences of archives, the things that we can't know because records weren't kept, they were destroyed, they were actively suppressed, and how those silences influence the writing of history. Not only because they give us a better rounded picture, but also in the face of the never written or censored aspects of the past, researchers have to marshal all the tools they can find. So together, these three papers on photography, on film, on the value of an anthropological approach offer creative ways to examine not only the individual layers that made up German-occupied France, but also to see and read the encounters among those layers. In the end, perhaps none of these approaches offers fully new perspectives. What they do extraordinarily well, though, is to underline the potential of what many of us might already suspect but not fully act upon. First, that stimulated by an anthropological approach, historians can no longer read archival texts without recognizing their own position and without attending to the cultural and social interactions within those documents. And second, that visual and film sources should not serve merely as illustrations and must be analyzed, in Brett's words, in their own right and in their own on their own terms. Because in order to understand the complexities of war and occupation, written texts alone are not enough. Thank you.
Okay, we have like 3 minutes. Oh no. I think it would be helpful for you guys just to hear the questions from people rather than to respond. So if people want to ask questions, and then if we have a little time at the end to respond, then we can do that. But yeah, Daniel.
Thanks. Thank you all for these really interesting papers. And I just wanted to bring in a couple of things that I was thinking as I was listening to you. The one thing that I'm sure Abby knows, having worked on this for so long and takes for granted, but you didn't actually say, is that Zucca got color film from the Germans. That's a really, I mean, when I taught this last week, I mean, it's really startling. You couldn't really, the screen was kind of bleached, but so there's a kind of direct analogy between him and Pagnol in their collaboration. And then I just wanted to say to Brett that although I really appreciate the insights that you're bringing, and I accept the overall framework, I would echo what the commentator said and say we need to hear more about when interests align. And I am a little skeptical, and maybe, and I'm sure you've experienced this over the course of your career, and maybe you think that now that we're so far from the war, nobody's going to kind of step up and say, wait. But I'm doing that because I think there's a difference between individuals and the state. And so I guess my question would be, all right, so Vichy newsreels didn't contain hateful racist rhetoric. what is that? But why is that more important, or why is that? What does that tell us when we know that the Vichy regime collaborated with the Nazis in the policy of genocide? And I guess, I would just urge you, as you develop this research, to think about that question, because otherwise, I know you don't want to sound like an apologist for Vichy, but, anytime, in a talk in which you criticize Paxton, in this case, for something that he deserves criticism for, you could create a wrong. And I would just add, in terms of the German archives can resolve questions, Paxton was the first one to show us that 40 years ago.
Well, Abraham Jekyll was actually the first one. But
the first historian of France.
That's true, yes. That's absolutely true. And I'll just say, Paxton, in an interview, talks about how he and Azima actually wanted to write a substantively different voiceover commentary, and Chabrol took it and basically did what he wanted to with it. So, again, not blaming him at all, but because Chabrol basically hired them to do a job, and then he got to do what he wanted with the product that they provided. So, yeah.
Other questions? I know, we're getting to the end, so I guess if you have other questions, you can come up and ask people up here.
Excellent.
And we need to go. Yes, it was. Thank you.